If you look at Britain on a map today, you might think its borders only cover the British Isles, but if you look at the world as a whole, you'll find 14 overseas territories where the British government still holds power, from Gibraltar to the Falkland Islands. These are the last remnants of Britain's once mighty empire. Just over a century ago, the British Empire covered a quarter of the globe's land and ruled nearly a third of its population. It was the empire on which the sun never set. But how did this small island nation become the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen? This is the history of the British Empire. The foundations were laid long before Britain even existed as a single state. For much of its history, the dominant power in the British Isles was the Kingdom of England, with a strong economy and military. England came to rule over Wales and parts of Ireland, though Scotland to the north remained a fiercely independent nation, successfully resisting frequent invasions from its southern neighbor. By the early 17th century, Queen Elizabeth I was commissioning adventurers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher to explore and claim new territories. They claimed many lands for England, but these weren't immediately followed by settlements. The first English colony in North America, at Roanoke Island in 1585, ended in mystery. The colonists vanished without a trace. Elizabeth also granted royal charters to joint stock companies to develop overseas trade. Companies like the Levant Company and the famous East India Company were given monopolies on all English trade in their designated regions. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who then became King James I of England. This union of the crowns meant he ruled both kingdoms, but they remained separate. James wanted to build on Elizabeth's colonial ambitions. New colonies were structured in one of three ways. A crown colony was ruled directly by the monarch, usually through an appointed governor. A charter colony was ruled under a corporate charter, often giving colonists more political freedom. And a proprietary colony was governed by an individual, usually the head of a joint stock company, run as a commercial enterprise. Over time, many proprietary colonies became crown colonies as they grew difficult to manage. An often overlooked but crucial part of this expansion was the plantation of Ulster. This saw Protestant settlers from Scotland and England move to Northern Ireland during King James's reign. This model of organized colonization became a blueprint for future English expansion, with many of its leaders later helping establish colonies in the New World. Throughout the 1600s, England expanded its colonies in North America and the Caribbean. Some were new ventures, while others, like New York, were seized from rivals like the Dutch. Trading networks in Africa and the East Indies also grew, with fortified trading posts being built. A key element of this mercantile success was the Royal African Company, founded in 1660. Over the next few decades, it became a leading participant in the brutal but highly lucrative transatlantic slave trade. During this time, Scotland looked on at England's success with envy and tried to establish its own overseas colonies. Unfortunately, nearly all of these attempts failed. Colonies in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton lasted only a few years. But the most disastrous failure was the Darien Scheme in 1698. The plan was to establish a colony controlling the overland trade route across the Isthmus of Panama. To fund it, a huge amount of capital was raised, accounting for nearly a fifth of Scotland's total wealth. When the ships arrived, they named the colony Caledonia and began building a settlement called New Edinburgh. But their efforts were doomed. The settlement quickly fell to food shortages, tropical diseases, and attacks from nearby Spanish forces. Even with a resupply mission, the colony was abandoned. Only a few hundred of the original 2,500 colonists made it back to Scotland in disgrace. The failure of the Darien Scheme plunged Scotland into a financial crisis. For many, joining with England and sharing in its colonial enterprise seemed like the only way forward. By the turn of the 18th century, England and Scotland were still separate kingdoms. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had shifted the political landscape, deposing the Catholic James II and bringing the Protestant William and Mary to the throne. English law was changed so only Protestants could inherit the throne, but this didn't apply in Scotland. So, under Queen Anne, efforts were made to unite the two parliaments and secure a Protestant line of succession. With the Acts of Union in 1707, England and Scotland merged to form the single kingdom of Great Britain. In the decades that followed, Britain fought in several wars against other European powers. These battles weren't just on the continent. They were fought wherever their colonial interests clashed. The War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714 with a British victory. In the peace treaty, Britain gained territories from France and Spain, including Newfoundland and Acadia in North America, as well as the strategic Mediterranean islands of Gibraltar and Minorca. Meanwhile, the British East India Company, technically not part of the empire, but a powerful colonial force in its own right, was battling its French rival across India. The decisive Battle of Plassey in 1757 saw the British wrestle control of Bengal from the local ruler and his French allies. This made the British the dominant military and political power in the region. It was the springboard the East India Company needed to expand its territory even further, either by direct rule or by using its private armies to intimidate local rulers into submission. This was just the beginning of Britain's ascent to global dominance, an empire built on trade, colonization, and military might that would go on to shape the world for centuries to come. The 18th century was a wild ride for global powers, and Britain came out on top, big time. Thanks to conflicts like the War of the Austrian Succession and especially the 7 Years' War, Britain scooped up a ton of territory from its rivals. In North America, the French were basically kicked out after the British captured Quebec in 1759. By 1760, New France was no more, and with Florida also passing from Spanish to British hands, Britain controlled pretty much the entire eastern seaboard of North America. The 1763 Treaty of Paris sealed the deal, also handing over Caribbean islands like Dominica, Grenada, and Tobago. Britain was now the undisputed king of the hill, the world's top colonial and maritime power. This empire was built onto things that went together like fish and chips, a powerful navy that ruled the waves, and a booming trade network free from foreign meddling. This trade explosion made Britain incredibly rich, mostly through taxing all the goods flowing through its ports. But, funny enough, it was this very issue of taxation that would spark a revolution and lead to the empire's first major stumble. You see, while Britain saw its colonies as its own property, it didn't give them the same rights people had back home. Throughout the 1760s and 70s, things got really tense between Britain and its 13 American colonies because Parliament kept taxing them without their say-so. The colonists felt this was a total violation of their rights as Englishmen. By 1775, they'd had enough and officially rejected Parliament's authority, which kicked off the American Revolution. Britain sent in the troops, but it was too late. In 1776, the colonies' leaders got together, formed the Second Continental Congress, and declared their independence. After a grueling 8-year war, Britain's forces were defeated, and the United States of America was born. The loss of America was a massive turning point. It forced the British Empire to pivot, shifting its focus towards Asia, the Pacific, and Africa. Explorers were charting new lands, and one of the most famous was Captain James Cook. He mapped huge chunks of the Pacific, claiming places like New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia for Britain in the 1770s. Tragically, Cook was killed in Hawaii on his third voyage, but his discoveries were crucial for the empire's next chapter. Australia, for instance, became a new destination for British convicts, a penal colony to replace the ones they'd just lost in America. The first shipload of convicts arrived in New South Wales in 1788, a practice that continued well into the 19th century. Britain also set its sights on the North Pacific. Explorers like George Vancouver mapped the west coast of North America in the 1790s, opening it up for British business, especially the lucrative fur trade. They pushed inland, over the Rockies, expanding British North America even further westward. But just when things were looking up, a new challenge emerged from an old rival. War with France flared up again in 1803, thanks to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. To protect itself and its vast empire, Britain poured a fortune into the war. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports and attacked their overseas colonies. The defining moment came in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar. It was a massive naval clash against the combined French and Spanish fleets. Britain won a decisive victory, though it came at a terrible cost, the death of their celebrated hero, Admiral Lord Nelson. Still, Trafalgar eliminated the threat of a French invasion and cemented the Royal Navy's absolute dominance of the seas for the next 140 years. When the Napoleonic Wars finally ended in 1815, Britain was on the winning side. The victory brought even more territory into the fold, taken from the defeated French, Spanish, and Dutch. The Ionian Islands, Malta, Mauritius, St. Lucia, the Seychelles, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Ceylon, and the Cape Colony in South Africa were added to Britain's collection. Many of these new Caribbean colonies had huge sugarcane plantations that relied entirely on slave labor. Britain had profited immensely from the transatlantic slave trade for centuries, but things were changing. The Industrial Revolution was shifting the economic focus to manufacturing goods at home. At the same time, a powerful abolitionist movement was putting immense pressure on the government. This led to the abolition of the slave trade within the empire in 1807. It took another 27 years, but in 1834, the institution of slavery itself was finally abolished. The century that followed, from 1815 to 1914, is often called Britain's Imperial century. After taking control of the Indian subcontinent, the British East India Company looked to expand even further across Asia. They founded Singapore as a trading post in 1819 and took Hong Kong and Shanghai from China after the First Opium War in 1842, but the company's grip on India was insecure. In 1857, local troops, known as sepoys, rebelled against their British commanders. The East India Company managed to crush the rebellion, but the British government decided the company could no longer be trusted to rule the vast country. So, in 1858, they dissolved it and brought India under direct British rule. India became the jewel in the crown, the most valuable possession of the entire empire. During this time, a new rival emerged, the Russian Empire. Russia wanted to expand into Central Asia and the Mediterranean, eyeing the crumbling Ottoman Empire's territory. This strategic rivalry became known as the Great Game when Russia invaded the Ottoman-controlled Balkans in 1853. Britain and France jumped in to support the Turks. They feared Russia would threaten their own interests in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The resulting Crimean War was a disaster for Russia and a major confidence boost for Britain. Although tensions in Central Asia lingered, a deal in 1878 created separate spheres of influence, and Britain gained control of Cyprus from the Ottomans as a strategic outpost. Africa also became a major focus for British expansion. After acquiring the Cape Colony, British settlers began arriving in the 1820s, pushing out the Dutch-descended settlers known as Boers. The Boers, resentful of British rule, founded their own independent republics. But these were eventually conquered by Britain in the Second Anglo-Boer War, which ended in 1902. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 was a game-changer. It created a vital shortcut between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, crucial for British trade routes. Britain couldn't take the canal directly, but it did militarily occupy Egypt in 1882 to protect its interests. The late 19th century saw the scramble for Africa, where European powers carved up the continent. Britain ended up controlling huge swaths of eastern and southern Africa. There were even ambitious plans to build a railway line all the way from the Cape to Cairo, linking their African territories, though this epic project was never actually completed. And that's where we'll leave it for today. At the peak of the British Empire's power and influence, an empire on which the sun, quite literally, never set. As the 20th century dawned, the British Empire stood at its zenith, a colossal power unlike any the world had ever seen. Its influence wasn't just limited to the quarter of the globe painted red on the map. Britain's dominance in trade and its role as the world's policeman allowed it to effectively control the economies of nations outside its formal empire, like China, Argentina, and Siam. This was the era of informal empire, where British pounds and naval power spoke as loudly as colonial governors. Connecting this vast network was a marvel of modern technology, the All-Red Line, completed in 1902. This global telegraph system was the Victorian Internet, allowing London to send instant messages to the furthest reaches of its dominions, a web of copper wire that bound the empire together. But even as this network was completed, the threads of imperial control were beginning to fray. Within the empire, a powerful shift was underway. The predominantly white colonies, settled by generations of Britons, were growing up. They had developed their own economies, their own societies, and now their own distinct identities. They were no longer just extensions of Britain. They were nations in their own right, and they wanted political independence. Canada led the way, forming a confederation in 1867 and gaining full self-governance, a new status known as a dominion. Australia and New Zealand followed suit around the turn of the century. They remained loyal to the Crown but managed their own affairs. This evolution from colony to dominion seemed like a natural, peaceful progression for the so-called settler colonies, but for others, the path to freedom was far more fraught. Closer to home, Ireland's long and painful struggle for self-determination was reaching a boiling point. For decades, Irish nationalists had pushed for home rule, a form of self-government within the empire. Bill after bill was introduced in the British Parliament, but each one was defeated. The argument against it was always the same: Irish independence, even partial, would be a crack in the imperial edifice, a dangerous precedent that could threaten the very unity of the empire. Little did they know, the real threat wasn't coming from Dublin. It was brewing in the heart of Europe. The name of that threat was Germany, and its rise would set the stage for a global conflict that would change the world forever. In the summer of 1914, the world plunged into the Great War. For Britain, the empire was not just a source of pride. It was its lifeline. The conflict was a total war, demanding every ounce of strength from the nations involved. Britain relied heavily on its vast territories for food to feed its people, raw materials to fuel its war machine, and most crucially, men to fight in the trenches. From across the globe, they answered the call. Over 2.5 million men from the Dominions and Colonies served under the British flag. Canadians, Indians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, and many others fought and died in the mud of Flanders, the deserts of the Middle East, and the beaches of Gallipoli. Their sacrifice was immense, a testament to the bonds of empire, but it also came with an unspoken price. These nations were proving their maturity and their loyalty on the battlefield, and they would not forget it. The war ended in 1918. Britain and its allies were victorious. The German and Ottoman empires lay in ruins, and Britain moved quickly to annex their former territories in the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific. On paper, the British Empire was now larger than ever. In 1921, it reached its absolute peak, covering more land and ruling over more people than at any other time in its history. But this victory was a Pyrrhic one. The war had cost Britain dearly, not just in blood, but in treasure. The country was financially exhausted, its economy battered. And the immense sacrifice of the colonies had changed the very nature of the imperial relationship. The same year the empire reached its territorial peak, Ireland finally won its independence after a bitter war. The crack that London had so feared had finally appeared. Across the empire, from the bustling cities of India to the villages of Africa, people began to ask a simple, powerful question: if Ireland, why not us? The seeds of independence, sown during the First World War, began to sprout in the decades that followed. Nationalist movements gained strength across the colonies. But just as this momentum was building, the world was once again thrown into chaos. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 put a temporary halt on the calls for independence. Britain, facing the existential threat of Nazi Germany, again turned to its empire for survival. Once more, the dominions and colonies provided essential economic, material, and military support. The forces of the empire fought on every front, from the jungles of Burma to the skies over Britain. Victory was achieved in 1945, but the cost was catastrophic. This time, Britain wasn't just battered, it was bankrupt. The nation that had once been the world's creditor was now deeply in debt, primarily to the United States. The war had shattered the illusion of British invincibility and left it in no position to maintain its vast, overstretched, and increasingly restless empire. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. What followed was a period of rapid, historic change. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan famously spoke of a wind of change blowing through the continent of Africa, and indeed, it was a gale force that swept across the entire globe. One by one, Britain's colonies were granted their independence. The process began in the late 1940s with the jewel in the crown, India, and continued throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, from Ghana to Malaysia, from Nigeria to Jamaica. The Union Jack was lowered, and a new national flag was raised in its place. It was a remarkable, and for the most part, peaceful dismantling of the largest empire in history. Nearly 400 years of British colonial rule came to a close. Yet, the story didn't end with a clean break. Most of these newly independent nations chose not to sever all ties with their former ruler. Instead, they joined a new, voluntary political association, the Commonwealth of Nations. It was a way to maintain historical and cultural links in a new era of equality and partnership. Even today, the ties forged during the Empire endure. 14 of these independent nations, known as Commonwealth realms, still retain the British monarch as their head of state. But perhaps the most symbolic moment, the final act in the long drama of empire, came in 1997. On a rainy night in Hong Kong, the last major British colony was formally handed back to China. As the British flag was lowered for the last time, it marked the definitive end of an era. The empire was officially a thing of the past. But is it really gone? Its legacy is all around us. The English language, spread by traders, missionaries, and soldiers, is now the world's global tongue. British culture, its legal systems, its sports, and its customs can be found in every corner of the planet. And perhaps the most visible legacy is in modern Britain itself. The island that launched 1,000 ships on a journey of empire is now a microcosm of that empire, a vibrant, multicultural society where people of almost every race, nationality, and culture that were once under British rule now live together. The journey of empire has, in a way, come full circle, ending right back where it all began. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more journeys into our shared past.